Hello, Tim Wilmot here, and welcome to my watercolor demonstration. This time I'm going to cover how to achieve different texture effects in watercolor. Now, just before I go through this video, it's free to watch but not free to produce. If you like these videos, please support me via Patreon at www.patreon.com/Tim Wilmot. For a very small pledge, I'll be able to bring you high quality full-length watercolor tutorials with commentary, and you can send me your paintings in for a critique. Normally I do that as a short little video back to you with extra hints and tips. As I say, more details, please go to my Patreon site. You'll find the links in the description of this video down below. So the subject of this painting is going to be Watermouth Bay. We've got some yachts in a row here. It's low tide. Watermouth Bay is in North Devon, UK. Very pretty sort of sheltered inlet. We've got, this photograph was taken in winter. We've got the hillside here with some deciduous trees, so winter trees. In the distance we've got a little bit of a promontory and headland. Then we've got, as I say, these yachts. Nice. The attractive thing about these yachts is that they're light against a dark background, so that generally works quite well in watercolor, having that contrast of light against dark. And the added dimension of the reflections with this little stream here going down to the coast. This little stream giving us some soft reflections of the wooded hillside behind, and a few masts being reflected as well. Also, what I quite like with this photo are these tracks here, which I think that the way that they're going, they're sort of leading us into the composition. So I'll try and feature that in my painting as well. Now, when I look at a picture like this, it's ready-made to change objects to suit the composition. For example, this red buoy over here, maybe we can move that closer into the composition. This dominant yellow yacht on the right hand side, I think I missed that out altogether. If I was copying this scene exactly, your eye would lead over here to this bright yellow yacht, and it's probably here. It's one of the biggest yachts in the scene. So I'm going to think about losing different things and moving some of these yachts around. Also, I'll try and include a figure in the scene, as I normally always like to include figures in different landscape scenes, just to add a little bit of extra dimension and interest and detail to the scene, and also some idea of proportion in the scene as well. So that's the subject, and as I say, a theme here is trying to introduce as many different textural effects as we can to represent all these different objects that we've got in front of us. So let's see how we get on. Now, the paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford, really good quality watercolor paper, and this is cold press, so it's the medium texture, and the size is 15 inches by 11 inches. I've got a soft pencil here, so this is the first stage to do our initial outline, and the first thing I'm doing is getting in the horizon. Quite a simple horizon, don't need to be too exact, with a straight level line. Just getting a rough approximation of where that will be, and then follow up with very quickly the hillside behind the harbour and the promontory beyond near the coast. So now to get in these yachts that are they're sort of standing up on their keels and supports, so we don't need to bother with any complex reflections in water. This is low tide, and they're just basically shapes. Think of these boats as shapes, a little bit like a flat triangle on top, and then a sort of curved hull boat shape below, and just get those in. Now I'm making them a bit larger than the picture. I think if I copied the picture exactly, these boats would be lost, basically. They'd be too small, so I've made them a little bit bigger. And now with that stream taking the water down to the sea, just get that approximation in, and the reflection in that stream as well, plus the reflection of that boat on the right hand side. So we're just getting in the main shapes here. As I say, I want to include a figure, and I think it's quite a good idea to have this figure creating a reflection as well. So I've got the figure coming towards us, very close to this little stream, and we've got a bit of reflection, a dark reflection there of that person. Right, so just firm up the boat shapes. And that little where that little boy is going to be on the right hand side. Just a few lines to help with perspective, and I'll add in some streaks going across the painting just to lead ourselves into the scene. So that's the initial stage done, making sure the drawing is as good as I can get it, and just defining those major shapes. So step 2, going in with the wash, and we'll start off with the sky. Very simple sky. It's not a big part of as regards the area, not a big part of the scene. So I'm just laying in a very simple wash here of blues and yellows, and we'll come down to the tree level. As you can see, very loosely applied to the paper, and going back up into continually touching up and adding extra pigment while it's still wet and while it's still quite moist. So down to just the base colour now, the base colour of the wooded hillside. And I'm really at this stage just covering up the paper. The sky's not going to be done again. That's finished. But we will be going over these darker areas, and of course with watercolor we're going from light to dark. Now I've got a bit of negative painting to do around these boats. A should describe my palette to you. So this is not an extensive palette, only a few colours that I'm using. Starting at the top, we've got neutral tint, then burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, viridian green, cobalt green, cerulean blue, almost in the middle there, then cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, Windsor red, light red, and cadmium orange, and right down the bottom is cadmium yellow. So I'm now on the surface of the harbour and going a little bit warmer with the harbour. So alizarin crimson, bit of light red. I'm going to paint around that figure as well. Now there is a slight slope on this board, maybe about 10 degrees or so, not very much. I can't make it too steep because of the angle of the camera, which is actually between me and the actual paper, so it's obstructing some of my view a little bit, but it doesn't matter. Now the sky, so pretty much the same value. The stream there is the same value as the sky, and then over to the right hand side and the nearby shore there. So I'm just greying down the stream colour just a little bit. So I'm now just going to add in a little bit of white ochre into this still moist stream area, just to dull it down just a little bit with this quite opaque paint, and we get a nice sort of soft texture effect in there. So I'm going to let that dry, and the next step is going to be the background, where I can go in a lot darker, and that will really make the yachts stand out, that these dark values against the lighter values. So as I say, normally after the wash, we're trying to cover up most of the paper, but that first wash has to dry 100% before we go in with the next step. Otherwise, if you go in too early, before things have dried, things can go horribly wrong with watercolor. Timing is of the essence, really important. So change of brush now, smaller mop brush. This particular brush has seen better days. It sort of lost its point a long time ago, and I particularly like it because having a bit of a jagged edge, it's lost loads of hairs over the years. You get some nice effects, nice textural effects when you're doing foliage or some kind of surface where you want to introduce some different textures, maybe an old wall, adding in the effects of different types of stonework. So I'm being very careful here with the mixing. Quite a dark mix. It will go lighter. And then adjusting the brush angle, trying to get a very jagged skyline of the trees, introducing a few little gaps here and there where we can see the sky beyond. So coming down to the right hand side, keep mixing up these colours. Over to the right. Now, as I'm going down to the harbour level, I'm going to go a little bit darker, a little bit thicker with the paint. The ratio of paint to water, and that will give me another effect. I really want to have different values and some soft edges in this wooded hillside. And then down to the boats, being a little bit careful with painting around the tops of the hulls. Now, with their masts, I'm going to paint those in white, with white paint at the end. So I'm not actually being precise with any masts here with a bit of negative painting. But being careful when I come down to the hulls not to go over them. So a bit of instant dark is grabbing the neutral tint, which I use quite a lot to get some instant darks. Got to be a bit careful not to overdo it. I mean, generally I'm mixing it with some other colour just to dull it down a bit so it's not too black. I mean, it is a grey black paint, and it does need to be added with other colours just to get those quick darks. If you haven't got neutral tint, then Payne's grey would be a good substitute. And so as you can see now, as we're reaching these boats, they're really starting to stand out with the difference in contrast, or these values, the dark background, the light tops of the yachts, and that works really, really well with watercolor. So it's all still quite moist. I can go back up to it and add in extra pigment just to give me different effects, a bit of bleeding, perhaps some small blooms, cauliflowers will appear, but I don't mind those. I mean, that's really what you're just allowing watercolor to do what it wants to do, and try not to fight it, just go along with it. So we can see a lot of these boat shapes, they're very slim triangles, really, like a very low pyramid. There we are again, just go back up into that wooded hillside, add in a bit more pigment. I've just picked up a bit of clear water. Drop that in a control way. Drop it in, and then just leave it, and hopefully something nice should result over the next few minutes. So the far headland, picked up a bit of yellow ochre there just to make that quite warm, really, but I do need to, I will be adding in a bit of shadow on the right hand side. The scene was a bit sort of, it was bright but not ultra sunny, so I'm just going to take the liberty of adding in a few shadows into the scene. Now as I come down to the right, I will make this headland here a little bit darker. Go around that right hand yacht. And then up the right hand side. I'm not copying the photograph exactly, I've sort of cropped that right hand side. And I'm just using my fingers there just to help things along. Now you can see with the clear water I dropped into that woodland, we've got some nice effects starting to appear, hopefully just giving the impression of the texture of that woodland in winter. It's not green, it's sort of a greyish colour. I mean, there'll still be greens in there with the ivy growing up the trunks, moss, and so on. Now down to the harbour, so I'm adding in a few horizontal lines just to help with the perspective and leading you into the scene, over to those yachts. All the way over, probably getting just a little bit weaker as we go into the background. Now this brush is a smaller mop brush with a good edge, because I've got to get some nice crisp lines. This is a Raphael brush. It's a synthetic brush, but it acts like a natural sable or squirrel mop. Now I'm going a bit darker here with the ground, just to give just make some marks here of these tracks I was talking about earlier when we saw the photo. Interesting sort of chevron of a mark, to one going to the left, one going to the right. Just a little bit of an extra dimension into the scene. And again, it's just leading the eye in, like the horizontal marks on the left hand side, leading the eye in, and giving a sense of depth to the painting as well. Right, mixing up a bit of green here, viridian, bit of yellow, not too garish. So this is a bit of seaweed or whatever on the right hand side in that middle ground. And then beyond, I'll go a little bit darker in value, but I still want to leave a few little slithers of light in the distance, so I'm not covering up the whole paper, and using this mop brush with its edge just helps me introduce those little gaps, those little horizontal lines where we can see the first wash below. Now for the reflection of the hillside in this little stream, gone a bit darker than the sandy bottom of the harbour, and a little bit darker in value. This is where hopefully the drawing that I did initially is accurate enough. So I'm just covering up those. Just going over those pencil lines as a guide. And we're almost using a dry brush stroke or technique here. Not much water on the brush. and just dragging it across the paper to give a kind of rough area. Particularly effective when you've got textured paper as well. Dragging across the paper with that dry brush stroke. And I also just add in a few dots here and there just to indicate maybe some pebbles or stones on the harbour bed. Now, these yachts, so very simple to do. We're leaving the tops of the yachts, that the triangular shape, as plain white, and then I'm going in with the hull and then dropping in the shadow being a lot darker. It's merging into, it's going against gravity, going up into the hull and just cementing it to the ground. So I'm going to try and make all the yachts a little bit different in colour. In with the hull, then in with the shadow soon thereafter. The two blend together. Maybe just a few gaps underneath or a few gaps between the hull and the shadow. Now for a blue or a light blue hull on that third one. And the shadow underneath that, doesn't matter if I go over this figure. Bit of a darker blue for the middle boat. And shadow. Sort of greyish hull on this one, similar to that second yacht. And just drop in the neutral tint. It's a bit thicker than the hull, so it's going to blend in with it quite nicely. Maybe have a little vertical just to show some support to that yacht. Now a red hull on this right hand boat. And shadow, just as I've done with the others. So now for some finer details. And I'm going to use a smaller brush for this, a round synthetic brush. Just picking up any sort of dark colour in my palette and a bit of detail to these yachts just to make them look a bit more boat-like, with some horizontal lines across the hulls, a few bits of detail on the cabins. I wanted a bit of shadow over this headland, so just a small little bit like that, just to add a bit more texture to it and depth to it with that darker value. So I'm just really, with the small brush, going around the painting, just touching up little areas, adding in some extra detail. Not much water with the paint on this brush, almost quite dry really, and the surface of the harbour, it's strewn with lots of little pebbles, so I'm just paying homage to that with just a few little dots here and there. Bits of seaweed as well. I suppose the other technique to introduce these little dots could be a bit of splattering, which that would have been a good alternative. I might need to perhaps cover up parts of the painting before splattering, just to make sure I don't splatter into unintended areas. A bit of a dark line on the water's edge, just to add a bit of definition to that. So as I'm using this brush more and more, it's becoming drier, and so we can get in those dry brush marks, a few nice soft edges, and sometimes use my finger just to smudge things. Right, this figure, as I normally do, start off with the face, possibly hands or arms, but I'll just go into the actual body of this figure. Let's make it dark. And I'll try and imply a little bit of movement with this figure. So a quick rendition of the legs, and of course the reflection. Again, I'm just pick up a few extra details, and a dry brush stroke there to give the texture of this rough surface of the harbour bed. I often use that similar dry brush marks for roads with tyre marks. Very effective to add in some dry brush strokes as a continuous line for, just to give the implication of some tyre marks. Still adding in a few more horizontals, just some discrete lines, thin lines in the background. Maybe something in that little stream there. So I've got to get in the mass, but first of all I'm going to put that buoy in. Now I'm putting this on the right hand side just to balance up the figure on the left. I think if I had this where it was in the photograph, it was way over on the left, I think it'd be too much happening on that left hand side, so add it over here. Couple of buoys with a little bit of shadow below them. Smudge it just to give us a quick soft edge while the paint's still wet. And before I go with the mask, I've got to make sure everything is really dry. So with my hairdryer here, fairly close to paper, move it around slowly. So I've now got a smaller brush, and with some white gouache I've added a bit of highlighting to the figure's head and shoulders. Now these masts should be done in one, not continuous vertical lines, but a few little gaps in them, a bit of lost and found, and try and not have too many even gaps between, even distances between these masts, different heights of masts as well, maybe some in the background just to give an impression of some distant yachts. So I need to get in the reflection of that right-hand yacht with the red hull. Add a little bit of water. And then a few reflections of the masts. Make sure they all join up. They're all in line. Pick up a little bit of a highlight on these couple of buoys on the right hand side. And I'm going to have to add in a bit of white for some of these masts. Bit more of a shadow under that buoy. Smudge it out with a finger. I think it just needs a few more little dots and spots and lines. Just to help define the texture of this harbour bed. And a few strategic diagonal lines just leading into the composition. And also those those horizontal lines where the yachts are, they're serving a purpose to join up those yachts as well, connecting them together. So do need to add in a little bit more white for the masts and some of the fenders, of course, on the boats. That really, these little fenders, these white fenders, do instantly turn something that may not look like a boat into a boat. Just with a few here and there. So this is the finished painting, and an exercise in producing different textures in watercolor. So for example, we've got the these cauliflowers, these blooms appearing in the forest on the hillside, which was achieved with clear water dropped into the wash while it was still quite moist, and with a slight slope on the board that with gravity travels down, and we get these interesting edges appearing, these soft edges, to give the impression of the different values that you see in that forest. And then some dry brush strokes across the surface to give an indication of maybe a line of shingle or little pebbles, some odd little dots here and there, little bits of dark below, areas of white, just to hint at some shadow perhaps underneath some of these maybe flatter slabs. And the texture of adding in a darker pigment, thicker pigment, into a light wash to let it bleed and blend in there. And then at the very end we used white gouache to give us these masks and their reflections as well. That white gouache that I added into the stream has given a sort of sheen to the surface, which is sometimes sort of quite difficult to achieve without using white gouache in that way. So hopefully you like this painting and an exercise in different effects, different textural effects. Simple scene, Watermouth Bay in North Devon, a row of yachts. If you want to see more of my paintings, please go up to my website, www.timwilmot.com. And if you do want to have a go at this and other paintings yourself and get a critique from me, please go up to my Patreon site, www.patreon.com/Tim Wilmot. So thanks very much for watching, and catch up with you again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.